from the United Nations in New York, an interview program on major global issues. This is World Chronicle. And here is the host of today's World Chronicle.
Hello, I'm Tony Jenkins. How much is poverty like slavery? Is freedom from extreme poverty a fundamental human right? Should the 21st century become the era in which poverty is abolished, the way slavery was in the 19th? These are some of the questions raised by the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva through the work of its independent expert on extreme poverty, Arjun Sengupta, who is our guest today. Professor Sengupta, welcome to World Chronicle. Poverty has been part of the human social condition since the beginning of time. Why should we suddenly focus on it today?
For a very simple reason, that today we know how to abolish poverty. Today the world community has enough resources, technical, economic, social resources by which poverty can be abolished. This was not true even, say, 30 years back. You could not have said that it can be abolished immediately, but today we can say that.
All right, we have the resources for doing it. The question is, do we have the obligation? I think we'll be getting into that with some of the other panelists. We're joined today by Susie Salmond of the BBC and Ricardo Alday of Notimex. Ricardo, why don't you jump in?
Mr. Gupta, yeah, I mean, it seems like a pretty obvious issue, ending poverty, abolishing poverty. It's like an easy, undisputable target. Why is it that it's so difficult? What is it that there is no consensus about the subject?
Well, it's a pity that there is no consensus, part of it because people don't quite understand the implications of this, but it is also a part that it requires a kind of an obligation, as Tony pointed out, which the governments, the duty bearers, which is quite often the corporations, other agencies, will have to take upon themselves. And these obligations must trump over other objectives, other social policies. This is the human rights language. Once you accept human rights, the obligations of human rights get the top priority to fulfill.
Is it really an obligation? Some might argue that why should a particular side can be responsible for the other in this particular context?
Well, this is the beauty of the human rights language. Human rights are fundamental objectives, constitution of for the national governments and for the international community. These are the binding principles. And once you recognize this as a human right, every agency in the international community has accepted through that recognition that this obligation is there. Now, it is true that extreme poverty or poverty as such has not been recognized as human right. But extreme poverty creates conditions, and everybody agrees. It is a serious degradation of human dignity, where human rights are violated. So it is that link has to be established. That can be done very clearly at every particular case. And once that is accepted, then if you accept human rights, then you have accepted the obligation to do everything that is within your means to fulfill those human rights. And extreme poverty is one of those obligations, the eradication of that.
Susie.
You talked about duty bearers and about the fact that poverty is a violation of human rights, and furthermore, you say that with correct political will, there will be very little poverty today. But if these 2 points are true, then arguably, as you're saying, then the actual obligation is put on the developed wealthy nations. And also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it suggests that that is so as well. But so who bears what responsibility towards solving the problem?
Yes, the first responsibility, as they call primary duty holder, is the state of the region where the individual belongs. But it so happens, particularly today's world, globalizing world, and we're talking about today, the state's maneuverability, flexibility of policies have been very much limited. And they cannot do things without the cooperation of the international community. They cannot have exchange rate policy, they cannot engage in expenditure, they cannot engage in fiscal deficit. Everything will go against their well-being. So they need to be helped. Now, this is why international cooperation becomes an obligation. And this is nothing new. UN Charter has given it categorically in Article 55 and 56 that all nations have taken the pledge that they would help every other nation to realize the human rights.
I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with you that that you say the first obligation is on the state in which the poor people live themselves.
That's it, yes.
And then you say, but those states can't do anything about it by themselves. They need international help.
That's it, yes.
I'm not entirely convinced of that. I recently returned from Liberia, a nation with just 2.9 million people, which has gold, diamonds, oil, vast hydroelectric potential, fisheries, tourism. 85% of the arable land lies fallow. They could pull 4 crops of rice out of the ground every year if they wanted to. And the reason that everybody in that country isn't extremely wealthy is not because the international community has let them down, but because they've had dictators for the last 25 years and a civil war for the last 14 years. You could say they've brought it on themselves, and there are many nations I could give that example to. Why is it our responsibility in the rich world to fix the problems they brought on themselves?
The first point is you talk about Liberia. It's a very good example. They have resources, but they are ruled by a regime which have other objectives.
They're a kleptocracy.
Well, okay, I accept that. But I would say that when I say that the international community is also responsible to cooperate, it doesn't mean every country has the same need of international cooperation. For example, in India, probably you can say that in the case of India, most of the problems of poverty can be resolved by the Indian government. But the only problem is that if the Indian government tries to do that, there would be problems of financial crisis. Those crises would require some kind of an international understanding of flows, etc. This is a very, system which is everything depends on everything else. But Tanzania, for example, they cannot do anything on themselves. They cannot sell their cotton because of the international prices. They cannot do anything without international assistance. So the nature of cooperation would be different in the different countries. In the case of Liberia, since you mentioned Liberia, I would say that the first duty of the international community is to see that that kind of regime does not get all the support from the international community. The nature of international cooperation would be different. I have no difference with you, Tony, on that point. And as I say, that the state is the primarily responsible. If the state doesn't do that, then of course the international community can say that you are not doing anything. But if the state is trying to do that, but it cannot help, then you need to cooperate. The international obligation for cooperation is clearly specified. It is a new form of humanitarian intervention. No war, no active intervention, but promote and help the other country to do what you think is necessary for realizing the rights.
You brought up the point about cotton and globalization of trade. I was brought up in Uganda, where a farmer there would get 100 Ugandan shillings, let's say, for a kilo of cotton, which is 10 cents. Now that China has joined the World Trade Organization, this means that, and obviously cotton prices are much cheaper, a Ugandan farmer cannot compete. Do you feel that, this globalization of trade is having a substantial effect on poverty, and if so, how are we going to even out this playing field?
This is a very good point. In many countries, the first impact of globalization may be people would be losing their jobs, they would become poor. But the hope of globalization is that the second stage, those countries will recover and will find better ways of using their resources. So in the case of globalization, I'm not saying that everything is going to go against the poor people. But we need a mechanism to convert the globalization into something that is consistent with human rights, consistent with the poor people's fate, poor people's dignity. This is why this is...
You have any ideas for such a mechanism?
Yes, this is
How do you work about it?
But this is the reason I say that today we can do that. You read Jeffrey Sachs' report. It clearly shows that it is possible to do that. In every step you can create the right kind of jobs, you can create the right kind of production, you can create the right kind of distribution. These are now, as economists, we know how to do it. So it is basically the political system which is actually
So
preventing.
just a matter of political will, so to speak.
Yes, but it's not just a matter. Political will is always explained by groups, their fight, the dominant group versus non-dominant group, the power position, and the international community. Political will is not something that comes from the heaven. I mean, it emerges from the dynamics of the social equation.
You know, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the context of this, which is that you actually prepared your report for the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, which, as you know, has come in for a great deal of criticism, especially from the United States, the Western states. They say that the Commission is dominated by countries which have nothing to say to the rest of the world about human rights, that they include some of the world's worst human rights abusers. Just recently, Zimbabwe joined the Commission, and Zimbabwe represses its political opposition, has shut down the free press, it beats up its opponents, etc., etc. Some might say that this is an effort by the Human Rights Commission to, if you like, poke the richer, wealthier countries in the eye and say, well, stop criticizing us for our human rights. How about you guys? You're not taking care of the most basic human right, which is poverty. What's your response to that?
You can do exactly the same way. First of all, your first point is too easy to, this is not only Zimbabwe. Many countries I can immediately point out are doing this. They are members of the Commission. They are members of the United Nations. This is how the world community has actually developed. But the point that
let me just say that, of course, as you know, Kofi Annan has also said that the Human Rights Commission needs revising, but precisely for this reason. It's not just in Zimbabwe. It's Libya. It's Cuba. It's a number of states that have very bad human rights problems at home.
Well, like the Zimbabwean minister says the United States also has the same kind of bad record. But I don't want to get into what Kofi Annan's proposals are, because that have to be debated very carefully. But what I'm saying is that your first point, that is it a method of fingering the industrial countries? It is just the other way around. The industrial countries can say that, look, if you have signed all these covenants, you have accepted human rights, so do something for the human rights of your country, including poverty eradication. The only thing they would have to add, that if you do something, we are here fully prepared to help you to the hilt. So it is the other way around also, and I believe that this has a tremendous potential, that if the international community comes and tells that this government, you must do something. If you do something, then we are going to help you. And why are you not doing something? Exactly the same way, because the world is no longer divided between developing and developed countries. It is divided between those who believe in human rights, they are willing to implement human rights, and those who do not believe in human rights. And this happens to be there across the countries. I mean, this is not in one country only.
Mr. Sengupta, how do you propose convincing, though, these wealthy nations that they do have this political will to actually an obligation to feed, to house, to help these people who have nothing, especially since the G7 met at the beginning of this year, and in fact it was the US who had opposed doubling aid donations from $50 billion to $100 billion. In this light, how can you convince these nations?
Well, I do not know whether I can convince them, but I don't see reasons why they would be opposed to it. I mean, assuming that they signed these or accepted these human rights documents or treaties in good faith, which I believe is a democratic world, they have done that. I don't see why they should be opposed to it. You see, there is one reason why they may be opposed, powers that may be, as I've been told by my American friends in the Commission, that if we are talking about right to housing, then I'm not worried about what is happening in India. I'm worried about what will happen in New York. I mean, this is their, and that's a very major point. I mean, they have to consider a right to health. You see, this is a very major thing that is going on here. So we may have to follow a different tack. That let us accept for the poorest countries, and this is why extreme poverty becomes important. Let us accept for the poorest countries, the people who are living in extreme poverty, we shall accept removal of that as a human rights obligation.
All right, well, here's a reminder. Let me just say, this is World Chronicle, and we're talking about the implications of defining extreme poverty as a human rights violation.